it is. Now we are recording. So I often blur the line between my casual chatting as we introduce the class and the actual important stuff that will contribute to the class. So political violence is this, this very interesting nebulous concept. And it's very narrative driven. You'll see as you continue, if you continue in political science, some of the major streams of thought, some of the major philosophies revolve around different concepts like how we present information. One of those streams is narrative. It is specifically narrative policy in public administration programs. You'll see it in political philosophy as narrative framing. When we study modern social media, framing and narrative creation is an entire subsection of social media. But this main idea of narrative, the kind of how we tell a story in politics is a major way of understanding what we are talking about politically, because we can frame any act of violence in multiple different ways. The sort of classic overt example of this is, one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. When you win a war, you get to kind of set the narrative of what that war was. And that was the way that history functioned for a very long time. Obviously, as we have increased communication, as we have more access to not just war zones, but individual, citizen experiences within those areas, as we've seen more and more of that over the past century and a half come to light, we're kind of backing away from that simple winner take all narrative strategy, right? It's not the narrative that comes out of a war now is not just the combatants. It's not just the victors or, the victims. We have so many more voices that we're able to hear, that we're able to get out of these conflicts. So it's no longer, this simple like, oh, well, either you feel that you have been invaded by Great Britain, or Great Britain has reclaimed traditional land for the nation. There are so many more voices that we're hearing that it makes political violence a bit more difficult to really comprehend, because political violence in its traditional sense is violence that's committed by a recognized state. So we think of this in terms of, yes, war, but also, violence against individual citizens that are supposed to be protected by the state. If we go all the way back to the beginning of the semester, when we talked about some of these basic philosophies, this social contract idea that we give up some of our security to be protected by the state. That way we don't have to just protect ourselves. That contract seems to be violated by almost any instance of political violence. And yet, Max Weber defines the state, defines power in an international context as having a monopoly on the ability to perform violence. So the United States, in Max Weber's view, is based on the fact that it has a monopoly on the institution of violence within its country boundaries. Within the state of the United States, the only one who has legitimate use of violence is the United States government. Now, given modern context, that also has some horrifying implications, especially when we're talking about policing, police violence, the level of violence that a state may commit against its own people to institute laws. The level of necessity there is variable, and is something that is obviously debatable, and there is no right answer as to how much violence is necessary to institute a government or is necessary to protect the same people that you are committing that violence against. So it gets extremely complicated, but all of that is to say, the reason that I organized the class in this way is that the book puts Germany and Japan under the, democracies of the world kind of section, right? But I think that there's a very important aspect of how the United States deals with violence internationally that can be directly compared by putting Germany's political experience and Japan's political experience next to one another. Both Germany and Japan were enemies of the United States during World War II, right? Under this traditional narrative structure, the United States and the Allies won World War II. So Germany and Japan both lost. Okay, is that fair to say? I think, in a very, very basic way of looking at World War II. You have winners and losers. Germany and Japan were on the losing side. Thinking about our relationship with those two countries, we committed traditional war against Germany, ground-based, trenches, tanks, planes, traditional warfare against Germany. Japan started in a traditional fashion as, using traditional warfare tactics for all of the reasons that Japan drew the United States into the Pacific theater. But the United States responded in a non-traditional fashion by dropping nuclear weapons on Japan, primarily aimed at military targets, but due to the very nature of nuclear weapons themselves, unable to distinguish civilian versus military casualty in Japan. I'm not going to make an argument that this was justified. Okay, I don't believe that that is effective to argue. We did. The United States did this. And that is the reason that Japan lost World War II. The way that we then proceeded forward with both of these countries, with Germany, right? Because we still have to exist in a world post-World War II, where we have winners and losers. The way that we proceeded forward with each of these countries presents us with a stark contrast. We helped, quote unquote, to build each of these countries new governments after World War II. We did that by influencing the constitutions that each country would adopt. And each of those countries is now recognized as a formal, full democracy because they have constitutions that are built on an American ideal of constitutionalism after World War II. But the way that we instituted those constitutions is very different between Germany and Japan. Germany, as I'm sure you discussed last week, as you will see from the reading that you did on Germany, Germany built their own constitution with the help of the United States and the UK primarily as a foundation. But Germany took that as an opportunity and was allowed by the UK and the US to make their own constitution their own way that fit with their traditional understanding of German politics. They recognized the empire era that they had entered into with the Nazis. They recognized the problems of a chancellor or president or any individual within a country taking on too much power through the democratic system that had been established. And so wrote a constitution that was uniquely German, was uniquely applied to the German system and the German people, that separated Germany into two countries, essentially, built the Berlin Wall to separate those countries and recognize essentially sovereignty of a kind between different nations of people residing in the same geographic area. They were allowed to do that in this very uniquely German way. Eventually, obviously, the German or the Iron Curtain fell. The wall was taken down. We were reunified Germany under a single constitution that was primarily the West's constitution, with a couple of adjustments to make sure that it was more inclusive. But that constitution was written it was written by Germany. Even with those influences, it was written to fix the problems that that constitution had experienced in the UK and in the US, which has allowed the German system to become one of the most stable political systems in the world. I think that that is readily apparent if you happen to go read through the German Constitution. You don't have to, but if you go read through the German Constitution, you're going to find that it sounds a lot like the US Constitution, but with a lot of the problems fixed. A lot of the problems that we've discovered over the past couple hundred years are fixed in that system by additional checks and balances, by additional specifications of the degree of power that any one individual person can hold, and by the ability to remove people from office before they get too much power. The German Constitution is written to prevent another Hitler from ever arising. It has a lot of other purposes as well, but that is one of the driving forces of the German Constitution. Now, the Japanese experience was very different post-World War II, because the Americans wrote the Japanese Constitution for them. There was not as much agreement, there was not as much, unifying work, there was not as much input, essentially, from Japanese bureaucrats into the process of writing the new constitution. And the United States, instead of taking this as an opportunity to do a similar thing as to what was happening in Germany, fixing the issues that were apparent in this constitution, they based it mostly on a parliamentary model from the UK. So borrowed some of those aspects, incorporated them into the legislature, maintained a system that was very similar to the United States, but balanced it with the inclusion of a prime minister. So they tacked on a prime minister, borrowed a parliamentary system for the legislature, and then added in an article that is present in no other constitution in the world. That is Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. Article 9 states that Japan will never have the ability to commit aggression militarily against another country. The only standing military that Japan is allowed to have, and has been allowed to have since the end of World War II, must be purely defensive in nature. So Japan is not allowed, because of this punitive constitution that was written by the United States, Japan is not allowed to commit aggression against another country. So this is a tale of two countries going through the same process at the end of World War II, with the same acting influences, but with very different implementations and very different results. Yeah, Reeves.
Quick question about that. There's no actual policing mechanism for Japan only being allowed to have a self-defense force. It's whatever they decide they think is a self-defense force, right?
Yes. Yeah, it is self-determined. But having that section in the Constitution means that they have, in fact, abided by it since the Constitution was written. there is a lot of power to constitutionality. And that is a good question to ask, because we have seen prime ministers, specifically Shinzo Abe, who is the former prime minister, very unfortunately assassinated, not during his time in office, was assassinated after his time in office. But Shinzo Abe was widely viewed as probably the most militaristic prime minister that Japan had had. He often spoke in way he never talked about overturning the Constitution, but he would speak about the Constitution as something that needed revision so that Japan was better able to defend itself. He pretty openly acknowledged or stated that Article 9 was too much of a constraint on Japan to defend itself in the modern era, especially with the aggressions of countries like North Korea. It's a very interesting dynamic to have that. Now, the current prime minister, Fumio Kishida, is less revisionist in his approach. He's kind of lukewarm on the idea. He supported it insofar as, he was a minister under Prime Minister Abe, but it's not something that the current prime minister is really pushing for. He is much more supportive of the Constitution as it is, on rolling back some of those military expenditures that had expanded, because as Reese, as you indicate, like, the amount of a defense force that Japan feels it needs is defined by the Japanese bureaucracy. It's not defined by other countries. So, there were a lot of critics of Abe who said that he expanded the military too far, that military spending had gone out of control during his time as prime minister. And that is something that we have seen recede slightly under Fumio Kishida. So we are, seeing changes based on the prime minister as far as how much or how far that goes. But it gives us this fascinating side by side, where we have the development of a constitution in Germany that is written by Germans and is written to prevent another Hitler from rising to power in a very German way. In a very, and I say German not as like, it's not like it's not that all Germans have some united view of what government should be. I say German in that, German politics, all the way back to, Kaiserships, German politics have been very legalistically minded, in a very Western way. And so seeing the development in Japan as a comparison point shows us what can happen if a country is not thoroughly involved in its own constitutional development. Now, as as a losing force in World War II, Japan was forced to adopt this constitution. It has been fairly successful, politically, as far as political stability goes in Japan. Japan has been fairly politically stable since the end of World War II. That has come at the cost of the Japanese system truly being Japanese in its effect. And so there is a disconnect for the Japanese people between themselves and their government. The way that they have fixed that is by expanding the bureaucracy that is so readily apparent and has become a force within the United States Constitution. Japan has taken that to the utmost. The balance of power in Japan is such that the National Diet and the Prime Minister do not hold a significant amount of power. They instead are effectively ruled by the bureaucrats. it is a pure bureaucratic system in Japan, and that has its benefits. That has, I think, a lot of historical ties in Japan as well. I kind of didn't mean to just go off on talking through this. I have a PowerPoint with some stuff from history and everything, so I'll throw that up as we continue to talk. But like, I think that Japan is just this comparison is so unique, and it's such a fascinating way of looking at these two countries, that I guess sorry, my I'll throw it up. We'll talk about the PowerPoint. My PowerPoint is titled "Everything Wrong with the Last Samurai," because I have some significant issues with that movie, and its presentation of Japanese culture and what it has done, I think, for students and for our modern understanding of Japan and some of these issues. So I will talk through a couple of these points. If there are things that you're curious about, we can talk more about those. But I want to kind of, with that preparation of these two countries that evolved after World War II and are very much so defined by the constitutions that were created at the end of World War II. It is fascinating to look at them side by side. It's also fascinating in the case of Japan to see how the historical development will get us back to why the bureaucracy is so powerful in Japan. So, like I have on the title screen here, Everything Wrong with the Last Samurai. This, I think, is a major image that we see culturally of Japan. Hopefully not Tom Cruise's face alone. Hopefully you know more of Japanese culture than just Tom Cruise's face. But this film, I think, sets a tone that has been pretty universal, of our view of what historically samurai are, as well as, kind of setting the tone for what we think of Japanese culture's development in modern America. So to give a little bit of the historical background, that leads us to this. During the 1500s, Japan experienced Japan up until that point had mostly been fractured into dozens of small kingdoms. Oddly enough, very reminiscent of Germany pre-1850. Japan was separated out. Everyone had their small plot of land that they ruled over. They all squabbled amongst themselves, and couldn't often, pretty much decide how to actually govern the country overall. A few hundred, let's see, about 600 years before this, Japan had been invaded by China, because Japan periodically throughout its history gets it in its mind that it should rule the entire world. It usually doesn't get much past the Korean Peninsula, but it tried. In the 600s to 900s, Japan tried to invade mainland, invaded a bit of Korea, got just up to, the empires that we were talking about when we talked about China, and the empires did not like that. So under under the let's see, that would have been the Shinto Empire. No, I'm forgetting it off the top of my head, but China basically reversed that process of Japan's expansion into the mainland, invaded Japan, and instituted the structure of classes that China had already developed over, the few thousand years before that. So Japan had a class structure, of localized warlords, a single emperor, that ruled over the entire country, but essentially functionally didn't really do much. So Japan mostly consisted of warring factions, for a great part of that history. However, that started to change in the 1500s. The first thing that changed was that the emperor, that had taken power really didn't care much, about doing emperor things, and just wanted to have a Japanese Renaissance, wanted Japan to become famous for its art. That's very difficult to do when Japan consisted mostly of a bunch of warring factions that had no desire to unite. However, the first of the Japanese unifiers, Oda Nobunaga, was a prominent warlord, a daimyo, which some of you may be familiar with that term now, thanks to the Book of Boba Fett on Disney Plus. But a daimyo is a warlord in feudal Japan. Oda Nobunaga was one of the most successful warlords, and began a period where, under his leadership, not the emperor, he didn't seek to compete with the emperor, but under the leadership of a militaristic daimyo, sought to unite the warring factions of Japan. And so took, what I think in the West we would consider kind of a Roman approach to this. Instead of just fighting to conquer the other sub-kingdoms of Japan, sought to just unify them and allow each of those, pre-existing warlords to serve under him. Some of them fought, obviously, this was a period of intense civil war. Some of them did pledge unity to Oda Nobunaga as the primary, what would become known as the shogunate in Japan. And so Oda Nobunaga is recognized as one of the first unifiers of Japan, was able to expand a single daimyoship into a majority of the mainland of Japan. His successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, continued this process, wanted to create this in such a way that it wasn't going to be a competition to the emperor. This was not something, as Toyotomi started in his process, this was not something that should be passed from father to son. It was something that would be passed from professional warlord, professional daimyo, to a successor that was trained to be the daimyo. They saw the problems out of this emperorship. They saw the problems when an emperor dies early and suddenly a 12-year-old kid is named emperor of a country. So they wanted to prevent that from happening by building a stronger shogunate, a military faction that would rule over the effective day-to-day of the country and allow the emperor to just be in his palace doing emperor things. Now, Toyotomi was very successful in continuing this process, expanded the unification of Japan across most of the neighboring islands, and was able to unite them under, again, one daimyoship. As he got towards the end of his life, though, decided that the best person to take over would be his son, whose name was also Toyotomi Hideyoshi, so it gets very confusing when you're studying Japanese history. He decided that his son would be the best person to take over. And that was widely viewed as very problematic, because it seemed like, instead of following this creation of a military shogunate, it was just going to make another emperor that would be trying to compete with the primary emperor of Japan, who at this time was still residing in Edo, the capital. So Tokugawa Ieyasu was the third unifier of Japan, and displaced the younger Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and instead took over as shogun of Japan. This primary leadership position. Yes, Tokugawa had to kill the younger Hideyoshi to do this, but that was, that's how you inherit an empire at that point. So Tokugawa Ieyasu was the third unifier, helped to bring Japan into what would be its true feudal period. As opposed to in the West, where the emperor was typically both the military and cultural leader of Japan, of a country. So, like, in the UK, the king was always both, was also, was the legal ruler, usually the religious ruler, as well as the cultural ruler of a country. Japan experienced a separation in these, and it was something that the emperor, by and large, was actually pretty okay with. It meant that the emperor could still maintain their position in Japanese society, could maintain the position of being a cultural leader of Japan, but didn't have to worry as much about maintaining that power. Essentially, when we look at modern systems of democratic government, this is the precursor in a feudal way, the precursor to the separation between a prime minister and a president. Japan just came across it in a feudal way 400 years before it was the mainstream of other countries. So we begin then at that point, the Tokugawa shogunate, which is a period of well, until my next slide, it was a period of relative normalcy and peace, where the shogunate was passed to military leaders to protect the individuals of the country and to balance the power of the emperor. Then Commodore Perry shows up. Commodore Perry was an American general, basically shows up to Japan in 1853 and says, hey, for the past 300, 400 years, you guys have not been open with the rest of the world. You've just been doing your own thing here on the islands of Japan. And that's a problem. You should probably trade with us. And I'm going to park my ships here until you start doing that. That is the Kanagawa Treaty in its most basic form. The Americans showed up and said, start trading or we're going to force you to trade with the rest of the world. This was not usually recognized in American history as one of our most imperialistic moves that we've ever done, was forcing Japan to open itself to the rest of the world. Japan had been, up until that point, extremely isolationist and just focused on the maintenance of this very dedicated system that they had developed under the shogunate. The reason that I relate all of this back to The Last Samurai is that this is the point when The Last Samurai starts. Because after the Kanagawa Treaty, we enter into a period known as the Meiji Restoration, or the Meiji Inshin. This is a period where Japan suddenly realized that they were very much so behind the rest of the world militarily, as well as, sort of the industrial revolutions that the rest of the world had experienced had not reached Japan yet, until they agreed to this Kanagawa Treaty and started trading with other countries. So very quickly, in a period of about 30 years, Japan instituted a complete reform of their military. That was not, as the movie shows you, that was not Tom Cruise teaching Japanese people how to fight with guns. This was mostly led by the Prussians. They were one of the major empires that would trade extensively with Japan, and informed their military development, as I think you can see by the changing Japanese military uniforms that look very Prussian and not very American. So it was not the Americans that taught the Japanese how to now fight in a modern war in the 1850s through the 1880s. Instead, it was the Prussians, because during that time, Americans were much more concerned with their own thing going on. As does happen in most of these situations, there was a cultural shift towards Westernization, and then a requisite backlash to Westernization. For a period of time, Japan very much so embraced the idea of Westernizing, advancing their culture, their civilization, as the Americans would word it, and industrializing the country with all the benefits that come with an industrial revolution. However, there was then a period in which Japan sort of started to roll back against that, and seek to reinstitute some of those traditional views of what was Japanese. Essentially, the Japanese people felt that this period of the Meiji Restoration was helpful for the development of Japan, but was not Japanese enough to identify themselves culturally as distinct from these Western influences. And so we see, in the time period of the film, we see this, attempt to reestablish the samurai class. Now, the big misunderstanding, what it got wrong about the samurai. What are the samurai in pop culture? Anyone?
I don't know, kind of like the Japanese equivalent of James Bond, I would say. Like they're kind of hyped up. I guarantee you they aren't the same in real life as they are in the movies.
Okay, so they're I mean I've never heard anyone call them the Japanese James Bond, but they're freaking awesome warriors, right? Like, the Last Samurai presents them as this elite warrior class that abides by the Bushido code. They have a code of honor. It sounds a heck of a lot like the chivalric code in Europe, right? Like these are basically Japanese knights that live their entire lives as warriors and are dedicated to the art of war. That is 1/12 of what Japanese samurai were. That's the only one we hear about, because the rest of Japanese samurai were a variety of different things. At different points in time, samurai referred to about 6 to 12 classes of Japanese citizen. So in this very structured class structure that Japan had, the samurai were all of the classes that served a shogunate. So yes, there is a warrior class of samurai. There were also sailors and pirates who were samurai classes under the Japanese military. All merchants were also samurai classes. At various different times, they occupied all of these different bureaucratic functions, the running of the government, the implementation of laws under the shogunate, police forces, what we would now call policing, which is a very modern concept, but the implementation of laws at the ground level of a shogunate were all tasked to samurai. Samurai were not just men either. Samurai were men, women, native-born Japanese, foreigners, could be elected to be samurai. In fact, Nobu Otonaga was the first person to have an African serve as a samurai, a transplant from Africa who was taken to Japan and then freed under Nobu Otonaga, and was elected to the samurai class. So like we have this singular idea of what samurai are as warriors who carry katanas and fight like Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai. And that is a very small portion of what samurai actually means, whereas we should see it as much more analogous to bureaucrats, the ones who are tasked with the effective implementation of government for a significant portion of Japanese history. Also, The Last Samurai presents it as though all of the samurai are killed off. That's not how it actually happened. Most of them just moved into governmental positions under the Meiji Restoration. The small group of those traditionalist samurai that did still exist saw that as a betrayal, saw joining this Meiji government as a betrayal to traditional samurai values. So where does this come from? This mass misunderstanding of Japanese samurai comes from a single novel. This sorry, there we go. Caught up to where I was. There was an author born in the second half of the 1800s in Japan named Inozo Nitobe. He went to England and studied English literature. He studied the chivalric code. And he said, this kind of sounds similar to some of the things that that the warrior classes of samurai under the shogunate used to practice. So I'm going to write a novel that I can sell to Western audiences, introducing them to Japanese culture. And he writes this novel called Bushido, The Soul of Japan, which is first published in 1899. And he takes it exclusively to Western audiences. He starts selling it in California first, because after his education, he moves to California. He starts selling it in California, starts selling it throughout the United States. It gets popular. The president reads it. Teddy Roosevelt reads it, and he's like, oh, look, this Japanese culture that we thought was so isolationist for so long is very clearly similar to the knights that we had in all of our old stories, all of our Western stories that we've based our society on. See, Japanese people are just the same as us. He buys 300 copies and just gives them out to people, all of his closest friends, all of the legislators get a free copy of Bushido, The Soul of Japan, so that they can hopefully better understand this country that we just 30 years prior had opened relations with. That book has pretty much single-handedly ruined our view of what true traditional samurai are, because it equated Japanese history to European history to make it more palatable for a Western audience. So those are all of my problems with The Last Samurai, as well as this extremely limited view we have that makes it harder to understand that bureaucracy in Japan is deeply rooted in Japanese political history. It is the primary force that Japan has engaged with since its unification in the 1500s. This is why Japan has been able to be a successful government. So it makes sense. World War II expansion, I like some of their posters that I think are really fascinating, attempts to kind of unite Japan with the West in their militaristic attempts. But that brings us up to this new constitution being written. So the new constitution gets written. It looks very Western. It does still acknowledge the existence of the emperor, but the emperor is completely a figurehead with no political power at all. They serve only as a figurehead to represent Japan on an international stage. And the prime minister heading up the bureaucracy takes a significantly larger role in Japan. So even though this was a constitution written for Japan by Western ears, or by Westerners, by Americans and British. Even though it's a system that is built for that, it has been adapted successfully to fit the Japanese history of a strong bureaucracy, and brings us up to the modern day, where that bureaucracy is what leads Japan now. Reese?
When you say that the emperor is a symbolic figurehead, is that like the UK where everything is kind of based off of the emperor doing the right thing, or are there more written safeguards?
No, yeah, it's so much less than the UK. Like the UK still has, the monarch is still the head of the government. The emperor isn't even that. in Japan. It is a purely symbolic historical position. And I say that the Japanese term is Ninhon Jinron, which I know I'm just saying on Zoom and nobody will ever remember that, but it is Ninhon Jinron, which essentially it doesn't have a very good English translation, but like the closest that I would call it would be like Japanese-ness. It's a very, it's not pride, but it is a very historically based concept of what is Japanese. And that is something that the Japanese government, Japanese leaders, and the Japanese people have held on to throughout all of this history. You know, like I said, the rebuttal to the Meiji Restoration was that it was too Western. It wasn't Japanese enough to maintain Japanese society. This constitution is not a Japanese constitution, but the bureaucratic strength that has grown out of it is so founded in Japanese history that it has given a comfort level with the implementation of it. The maintenance of the emperor, purely a tradition in Japan, that they will always have an empire, the emperor, even when they don't have an empire. They will maintain that emperor as a central facet of what it is to be independently, uniquely Japan. So on this last slide, just if you want to see it, see it in its form, this last slide I've copied over Article 9. It's very straightforward. It gives us, like I said, it's a very unique approach to international relations that positions Japan as a peaceful regime in a way that most other, even democratic nations are not. I feel like I tried to cover all of Japanese history in like 20 minutes. There's so much more. It's amazing. I love studying the cultural and political development of Japan. It is one of my favorite countries. So if you want to discuss it further, by all means. But I hope that gives you enough basis to have some good questions this week. Have a wonderful discussion on Friday with Will. And we should be back to full schedule next week. My health is better. I'm improving. I mean, I'm getting there, you know. I could still probably eat less candy, but you know, my heart's good. So I look forward to that. Any final questions before we wrap up? Cool. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good to see you. See you next week.
Bye.
Cool.
Yeah, hope you're doing better. Hope you're on
Thank
a
you.
good path to recovery and everything is going smoothly. Let me know if you need any help along the way, if anything else.
Yeah. I'm not too concerned. I will jump into looking at the country one analyses. I don't know that I'll necessarily need help with that, but I may. If I do,
Right.
I'll email you, we'll chat.
Yeah, just let me know.
Yeah, but if you want to jump in and read them just to get an idea as well of kind of where the students are at in their examinations, I think
Okay.
that would help. But yeah, discussion on Friday, good to go.
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. And we will meet this coming Monday and use that time to kind of catch up on everything else.
Sounds
But
good.
I'm glad and I appreciate your support over the past couple weeks.
And of course, no worries.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Will.
Thank you. Yeah, have a good day.
You too. Bye.